Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, the Teachers Guild of New South Wales would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we gather today and pay our respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and First Nations people participating in this event. We honour the elders both past and present and recognise the enduring cultures and connections of Aboriginal peoples to the lands and waters throughout Australia. My name is Patrick Name, the Vice President of the Teachers Guild of New South Wales, and I express my gratitude to each of you for joining us for our Guild Education series. Today's discussion centres around the topic of the importance of Indigenous education in classrooms. And it is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panel who will provide invaluable insights on this subject. Our distinguished panelists are Mr. Phillip Heath, AM, Head of College, Barker College, Ms. Justine Kolliou, Head of Indigenous Education and Mathematics Teacher, the Scots College, Mr. Tejcek, Indigenous Liaison Coordinator, St. Columba Anglican School. And we are also grateful to Dr. Lauren Knussen, School of International Studies and Education, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, University of Technology, Sydney, and a Guild member of the Teachers Guild of New South Wales, who will be moderating this event. I extend my thanks to our panelists for their presence here today. Before we proceed, I would like to address some housekeeping matters. Please feel free to share your experiences, thoughts, and questions in the chat function. And for any questions, please, if you could kindly use the Q&A box in the Zoom control panel. And I request that you keep your questions concise and relevant to the topic at hand. Our moderator will guide the discussion and pose questions to the panel during our session. Once again, I express my appreciation to Phillip, Justine, and Chris for joining us today. Over to you, Lauren.
Thanks, Pat. Good evening, everybody. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where I'm coming from this evening, which is Darra country in the beautiful Blue Mountains. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm very excited about this discussion this evening. I have the privilege in higher education of working with some wonderful Indigenous educators, and it's such an important area to focus on. And I also appreciate that for teachers and in schools, it can be something that we are challenged by, or we want to do with respect and in a non-tokenistic way. So I think this is a very important discussion for us to have this evening. So I'm going to start off by asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves and the work that they do in this area, and also pose the question to start off with, why is Indigenous education so important and going beyond the sort of cross-curriculum priority areas in the Australian curriculum? So I might ask you, Chris, to start off with that introduction and question for us.
Thank you. If it's okay, being that we're working in this this sphere of Indigenous inclusivity and cultural respect, Phillip, would you mind if I pass to you first as our elder in the
Thanks, Chris.
I'm not dodging the question, but I'd just like
No.
Yeah.
No, well, thank you. That's more than generous. And thanks, Lauren, and thanks to the Teachers Guild for this initiative. It's so important. So I'm very honoured to be with you today. Thanks to those who've set aside the time at a very demanding time of year to engage with a topic that I think is of the utmost importance in the national spirit. So as Chris was kind enough to say, I'm Phillip Heath. I've been head of Barker's for the last 10 years, and before that was the principal of Radford College in the ACT, and before that, for over 14 years, the head of St Andrew's Cathedral School in the city. So my journey in this space, apart from the kind of lifelong search that we've all been making about how to live safely and securely and respectfully on this country, probably took its origins in about 2005-06. In 2007, we began the Gawara School in St Andrews, and that's been flourishing since then. Moved around, and then in 2016 started the Darkinjung Barker School. In 2020 started the Narralindale Barker School up in Wollombi, That's on Wonnarua country. Darkinjung was obviously on Darkinjung country in Yarramalong. And then the third one of these and the fourth one I've started is up in northeast Arnhem Land, so with the Yolngu people in partnership with the Yothu Yindi Foundation, Gumarch Corporation and the Yolngu folk in northeast Arnhem, and that's called Dupama Barker, and that started in 2021, and they're all thriving. They're all K-6 schools, and we're about to start a high school up in northeast Arnhem to give the kids a continued extension. Some of those graduates of those schools have come here. So the moment you have one Indigenous or First Nation student in your community, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander student in your community, the community, if they haven't already, needs to adopt a consciousness of Aboriginal lived experience. It changes, it's not just tokenism, it needs to change fundamentally how we think about learning and being and living on this country and how respect articulates. So I've been adopted into the Yolngu people. I'm a Gumarch person, then have a skin name and a traditional name up there. And I've worked out where in a complex moiety system where I fit and what those obligations require of me. So it's a great joy to sit here and talk about these matters, which I think are of the utmost importance in the national story.
Thank you, Phillip.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you. Might come to you next, Justine.
Yeah, sure. My name's Justine Kolliou, so I'm coming to you from Bidgul, Gadigal, Dharawal country. So and I'd like to acknowledge also the traditional owners and custodians of the land that I'm on and the lands that everybody here is on. So I guess it's a bit of a funny story. It's kind of sad story as well. I grew up in Melbourne in the 80s, and I guess I was a product of the times. I got to university and I was rather racist. I had no knowledge of our country's history. And I don't even think I'd ever spoken to an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person. And until I was maybe 19, 20 years old. I failed Aboriginal studies at uni when I was doing my teaching degree because I thought it was just a waste of time and ridiculous. And then I thought I knew everything. And then I started working for the outdoor ed department at Melbourne Uni and did trips around Australia for the international students. And so I was traveling all around Australia on university holidays, having a great time. And we went into Wallace Rockhole community, which is a community in Central Australia. And I didn't even know remote communities existed. And it sort of blew my mind. And then on another trip, Northern Explorer trip, I ended up in Arnhem Land. And I loved these trips. And I loved the adventure side of things. And then in third year at uni, I hated teaching rounds while I was at uni, but in third year uni, there was the opportunity to do a remote placement. And in my head, I thought, brilliant, this will be like a teaching round that's a holiday and an adventure, and I won't have to do much, and it's just going to be fun. And so I applied and got it and found myself in Freegon on the Pitjantjatjara lands in Central Australia. And within a week, I couldn't believe it, but I was ringing home saying, I think I want to live here. And that month changed my life. I realized so much about myself and about what was wrong. Well, not what was wrong with the education system, but that there was plenty wrong with our education system, and that I was a product of that, and that I was going to be contributing to the problems, and unless I changed a lot of things. And so that sort of began my journey there. I went straight from uni back out to Freegon. I lived on the Pitjantjatjara lands for 2 years and taught the primary school class, so the prep to grade 5 class for 2 years. And it was probably two of the most influential, magical, amazing years of my life. And yeah, like Phillip was brought into the community, into the families, and just some extraordinary experiences. And so I guess I just made it my goal that I would from then on ensure that whatever student I taught, whatever culture they're from, that in Australia, that I would ensure that I was they would leave me not like I was when I was at school. They would learn about our country's history and culture and have a really good experience with that. So I've taught in Arnhem Land as well, a high school class in Bournemouth, and I've taught out in Pomperow and Cape York. And then I've ran sort of Indigenous education programs back in Melbourne in primary schools and high schools, and now I'm running the Indigenous program here at Scots College in Sydney.
Wonderful, fabulous experience. Thank you, Justine. Chris.
Thanks again, Lauren. I'd also just like to start by acknowledging the land of the Biripi people. I'm in Port Macquarie at the moment. And as well, as I have learnt over many, many years of having Indigenous culture placed very strongly in my heart, that there's very rarely coincidences, or that there is always coincidences, but I'm just sitting here with a big smile on my face that we've got 3 panelists here that, to my knowledge, we haven't met in person before, and we're all perfectly linked. I was also a child of the 80s who grew up in Melbourne, and I'm also adopted into Yolngu culture in Northeast Arnhem Land as well. So there's a beautiful link between all 3 of us, and probably many, many more, which will flesh out over the course of the evening. I have a very interesting background as well. I was born on little island of Penang in Malaysia. I was an Air Force kid. My dad's parents were came out to Australia after being part of the Holocaust. He lost his parents at quite an early age, but before he lost his parents, his dad had a very, very strong connection with Indigenous Australians throughout that sort of Lightning Ridge area. And it was really, really interesting that only over the last few years I've sort of been unpacking that with my dad, and how much his father really saw a link between the persecution of his people and the persecution of Indigenous people in this country, which led to a sort of an interesting beginning of, there was things in our house that were gifted to my father that were very, very sacred objects, and they were things that, many museums around the country would have loved to have had on their shelves, but have since been returned to country. But these were things that I used to just hold and play with as a child. And from my earliest recollections, when people say, what do you want to be when you grow up? I only ever had one answer, which is I want to be Aboriginal. And it was a seed that was placed so strongly in my heart from day dot, and has never, ever left, and has grown and grown and grown for many, many years, and really, really found its home when I, too, like Justine and Phillip, found my spiritual home in Northeast Arnhem Land. And I also like to acknowledge my family there on Yolngu country, as I'm sure we all are tonight. I acknowledge that my Yolngu name is liturgy, which is the sacred fire, which came in the eyes of the baru, the crocodile. Thinking about why is this important? Why are we talking about this tonight? The first 2 words that came to my head was just cultural pride. I'm currently helping out a colleague and helping to teach a history class here at St. Columba, where I work as an Indigenous Liaison coordinator from kindergarten to year 12. But I started off as a secondary geography, marine studies and sustainability teacher. And we're starting to look at Polynesian culture at the moment, and it's so amazing how year 7 students just say, gee, they look so proud, that the Maori are so proud of their culture, and why don't we have that? Why is that lacking in our country? And I think it is there, and it's in a massive growth stage at the moment. So why am I doing this? Why are we here tonight? To embrace cultural pride, to embrace the fact that we live in a country that has the oldest continuous culture on the face of the planet, over 65,000 years of cultural heritage, and so much that we can learn. My external from school life, I work as I'm a farmer. I'm a regenerative farmer on our land, and I've worked as an environmental scientist. So that's my background. And I've always felt an incredible connection to country and to the land, and always just found myself gravitating and having friendships within the local Indigenous community, and have built really strong ties with the local Biripi community, Yolngu community, and then a pretty interesting place called One Arm Point, which is up north of Broome, up near Cape Leveque, if anyone's been there. So I've kind of got a little triangle of connection throughout this country, which I really feel very blessed to have. But yeah, very honoured to be here tonight.
Thank you very much, Chris. And thank you, everybody. The power of that connection that you're all expressing there with the various lands and countries that you've been on is really impactful. And we're all on country all the time. And so let's bring it back to our schools in our local areas now. And can you talk to us a little bit about how we can start to think about embedding First Nations knowledges and pedagogies perhaps in our schools in a day-to-day way, and then we'll perhaps sort of drill down a little bit more specifically to certain areas. Phillip, I might come back to you for this question first of all.
Sure, thanks, Lauren. So I've got a number of tiers in the answer to that. Tiers in the sense of levels, not tiers in the more emotional sense, although there's some of those as well. So for Chris's sake, my name is Sganbalapala, which would be a name you're familiar with, I think, up there. And skin name is Gudjuk up there. So puts me in the Moiety group that he would be familiar with. And also Fergus too, I notice on the webinar chat line has been adopted. So for the Arnhem Land people, really culture, Manukay, Bungal, the narrative of kinship, Guratu and so forth is the curriculum. So we created a curriculum around the church panels, if some of you are familiar with the church panels at Yirrkala, and story and season and land, totem and responsibility in culture and law and language is the essential driving force. And then we actually adapt the Australian curriculum into that. It's absolutely bilingual. The language of instruction is English, but there are Yolngu Mata speakers in every classroom doing everything, and we weave the narrative in community, no matter what is happening, into the classroom story. Several days per week are out on country. We then do it, then we bring it back, sing about it, dance it, write it, depict it, paint it, create story around it. So it's not an add-on, it is what we are there for, and it is an incredible privilege to be amongst that community when I'm lucky enough to be there. In both Wollombi, Narralindale and Darkinjung, those two schools are about recovery of language and story, recovery of identity, and building up that sense of place, learning names for seasons, names for ceremony, the recovery of Darkinjung language, Wonnarua language, and so forth, and then turning that into a critical piece about identity. So that's in the K to 6 narrative. There's lovely scope for doing that within the Australian curriculum, and then we embed literacy and numeracy skills as part of that. Here in metropolitan Sydney, however, the story is really quite different. We need to be about educating essentially Ballinda's, non-Indigenous people in what is the Aboriginal First Nation experience of this country and what language is, what culture, law, kinship and obligations actually mean, and then develop from that narrative a respectful understanding. So we adapt it in science and in agriculture and English and literacy and music. And in movement and dance and PDHPE, we do a whole series of things like that, which is intentionally about remembering and recovering. And then finally, and there's a lot more to say about all of this, and I shan't, but finally, it is made easier because these are not abstractions. These are humans. These are people with whom we have a direct connection. And when they come into our community, which is relatively regularly, they come in as full-on equals and indeed experts. And they're endowed with the enormous respect that comes from their expertise in First Nation experience. And we all need to sit down and listen and mourn and be grateful and recognise that the spirit of the land that we walk on now still carries that same story for countless generations. And we have the privilege now of having that unpacked for us, imperfectly at times, but curriculum then is a vehicle that allows for that if we have the gentleness of soul to listen. So it's quite a multi-layered story, Lauren, and each circumstance has to be a bit different. And we have to defer to the eldership and the authority of the First Nation leaders themselves.
Thank you, Phillip. That's incredibly
Too long, but yeah.
No, it's an incredibly rich answer, because I think it's important to capture all of those elements that you've talked about there. And I might ask Chris first, perhaps, to talk a little bit about what that looks like in your school. And do you work with the local community around the school? How does that sort of come into the teaching and learning in your context?
Did you say Chris?
Yes, Chris, but you're on mute, Chris, sorry.
That's a classic from the COVID days. Thanks, Lauren. I just wanted to firstly just acknowledge how wonderful it is that there's a principal of a school in our country that thinks and feels like you do, Phillip. I'm sure there are many, many others, but you know, the fact that you're a panelist tonight and to hear you speak like that, it's wonderful. It really, really is. How do we do that in our area? Very, very gently at the moment. I've been in this role at the school for now just on 4 years. Having an Indigenous liaison at the school in a formal capacity has sort of been really only for the last 4 years. We've had some people dance in and out of that role. Other people that were sort of teachers at the school who sort of did that as well as teaching, but not formally as their role. And then we've had some other people who were sort of fairly short-lived in that role. But one of the things that we acknowledged, or at least I acknowledged in taking on this role, is that there was a lot of community perception, particularly towards our school. You know, we're one of the wealthiest schools, if not the wealthiest school in our area. And being someone who's grown up here since I was 10 years old, I know that there's areas of Port Macquarie and our surrounding district that are certainly not wealthy areas at all. And there was a big challenge with getting past that idea of getting community on side with our school, that it wasn't something that was out of touch for community, or that they weren't welcomed within our school. There were some perceptions that we had to break down about our school, and then I suppose address the fact that many of our surrounding areas, Taree, Kempsey, are hugely impacted by the mission days and still are. So we have people of the stolen generations who have come from all over the country and are in this area, and it's incredibly complex. Really, really fractured culture. strong culture, as it is throughout the whole of our nation, but a lot of brokenness. And language, for example, is in a huge revival state here. You know, some areas just north of us, like Coffs Harbour and Gumbaynggirr country, have obviously opened up their full language school. And whereas in Port Macquarie, Taree, we're just in a place where only full language speakers or Cert 3 and above Indigenous people of the area are learning and teaching language. So, you know, it's really wonderful that there's schools that are in place in culturally strong places like Northeast Arnhem Land, and I suppose it's a pleasure to be in a place where culture is starting to be valued and in such a revival state as it is on the Mid-North Coast, and I think up and down the East Coast. The big thing that I found, I suppose, personally working in my role is, and I think it really touches on what the way Phillip was talking, is to just be very, very humble and accepting of the fact that we all need to listen, and that we're coming, you know, every single teacher, every principal's coming at this from their viewpoint, and we need to start looking at what's your viewpoint. How do you view things? And realizing that they can be all right, and there's not a right or a wrong. There can be many rights. I think I'll hand over to
Thanks, thank you, Chris. I think that that theme of listening is coming through very, very strongly. And Justine, obviously you've got the country, the community that your school is located on, but also you've got the community within the school, the students, the teachers. Can you talk a little bit about that and your work and how you sort of make those connections and what that looks like in practice?
So I guess in practice, a lot of people I sort of speak to when they say, you know, I try to connect with the local LALC and the local Aboriginal Land Council, but nobody responds, or I don't get anything back and things like that. And something I say to them is something I learned very early on when I was in Freegon was attendance rates are really, really low. And some days I'd have no kids in my class. Some days I'd have 2, some days I'd have 10. And then I'd have someone who I'd never seen before because they've come from 2 hours away and they're now on my roll and so forth. And I was like, what's going on here? And one of the women explained to me, she said, you've got to understand that the parents of these children, a bit like what Chris was saying, they grew up in the missions, and a lot of them part of the stolen generation and things like that. By not sending their kids to school, they actually are protecting their children, because when they went to school, they suffered all sorts of horrible things, abuse, all sorts of things. So they're actually being good parents, if you can spin it around that way. And that blew my mind. I thought, I've never thought of it that way. Like, these parents actually, they don't know who you are. They don't know what to expect. So it was about sort of gaining trust and things. And then the kids start coming to school. And again, it comes back as well to learning to listen. I learned to listen when I was in community, I think, for the first time. It's amazing. So I guess bringing that back, that experience back to, I guess, in the city sort of area, and when I'm talking with other teachers about connecting with their local land councils and things, it's about building that relationship. You can't just sort of rock up and expect the land council to come and take over things at your school. It doesn't work that way. You've got to be prepared yourself to go on that learning journey, and they're there to support you, but they're not going to do it for you. And you might have to go several times. It's like building a relationship with anyone. You've got to actually build the relationship. So it's about really connecting with the local council. So at Scots, I'm in a unique situation, I guess, where, like you said, Lauren, I have currently 17 boys, and they come from all over Australia. So I've got kids from Yolngu country, I've got Wongatha kids from WA, I've got kids from Dharawal country, Gumbaynggirr country, I've got Torres Strait Islanders. And so and something, I've been collecting data on my boys, and every term I get them to fill out sort of things. And something I noticed with the data was that I'd been tackling all sorts of things, but their feelings of connectedness to country and culture was not improving. And so every year I fly all the parents in and bring them all together. They're sort of like my little committee. And I said to them, I presented the data and I said, look, I've noticed this. What do you think? And they said, yeah, we agree completely that, and that's our biggest concern when we're sending our kids off country to get an education. That's great, but what about that connection to country and culture? And I said, well, I need your help here. I don't know what to do about this. How can we sort of fix this? And it was one of the most beautiful moments. They all sort of looked at each other and had this conversation and said, we all come from different mobs, we're all different countries, but how about while our sons are on Dharawal country, you Dharawal mob take on our boys? And the parents there that were from Dharawal country just said, yeah, we can do that. And it was so lovely. And so we've set up now a mentoring sort of program with the local land council. They come every week and teach the boys language and dance and just hang out with the boys. And even though they're from, and it's acknowledged that they're Dharawal men, and but they talk with the boys, what's this word in your language? And they sort of, it's that connection, but just building those relationships and things. So again, I guess it comes back to listening, asking for help, but being willing to put in the work yourself, because it's not up to the Aboriginal children in your classroom to teach all the other children. You're the teacher. You've got to do that. And so I guess connecting with the local land council is really, really important, and it does take a bit of effort and time, but it's so rewarding when you get there. And also things like, I think someone mentioned in the questions, things like the 8 Ways program, which I think is just a really sort of a lovely way for teachers sort of new to this as well, as helping teachers learn how to use Aboriginal learning techniques in their teaching and things. And that I'm not an Indigenous person, but there are things that I can do respectfully and well, and that will make a difference. So it's just about, I guess sort of finding those things and making those connections with people. So yeah,
sounds wonderful. Oh my goodness, I'd love to sit in on some of those experiences. It sounds amazing. And that's it sort of brings me around to thinking as well. And actually, I just wanted to cut in and say, before I move on to the next question, that we've had some questions about resources. We have some wonderful resources and frameworks and approaches and things like that we will be very happy to share. Some of the panelists may share some with you during the chat, but I think if we collate everything and put it in an email, a follow-up email to all the participants and potentially on our website too, that would be very helpful to people. So
can I just say, I'm just going to put a link in the chat that is the Sydney University Library Guide for Aboriginal Studies Home, and it is one of the most phenomenal, helpful things I've ever come across. It has stuff in every area, and it is just amazing. So I'll put that in.
Fantastic. Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Lauren, quickly, I was just listening to Justine talk then, I really can't emphasize how important trust is. And it's something that can't be forced or can't be rushed. I feel very lucky in that when I stepped into this role, I had a very, very long-lasting friendship with one of our senior elders of community here, Uncle Bill O'Brien, and his wife Maz. They're like Nana and Granddad to me here in Port Macquarie. And that was a relationship that was well outside of school. And I was very, very lucky that was in place. But I've had people ask me before as to, like Justine said, I'm trying to get hold of the Land Council because I want them to do this and I want them to do that. And I said, just pause a little bit on your language. And it's very much, I want, what can I get? And even that idea of why are you trying to build trust with me? Is it just you can build trust so you can, do better in your school to, perhaps tick a box that your school wants to tick off. But I think building that genuine friendship with your local elders, with your local community, because you want to, not because the syllabus says so or your principals ask you to, Getting back to what I said, let's have some cultural pride. Let's get really excited that there's people throughout all of our communities that have an incredible knowledge there and can tell you things that you might not know. And also equally interested in what you might know. You know, when I sit with Uncle Bill all the time, he often says to me, and I say this very humbly, he's like, "Yeah, you've got a better knowledge of local bush tucker than I do." And we share all the time, and it's not a take relationship, it's a give and take. So I think really getting elders on board is very, very important. And one of the things that I think is also important, particularly if you have, you know, well, any amount of number of students at your school. I've got 63 Indigenous students from kindergarten to year 12. When I started in this role, I went around the school and I asked every single one of them how many Indigenous students they thought were at the school. And I think at the time, the highest number I got was 12. Mm-hmm. So the first thing that I did was I spoke with Terry Muldoon, our previous principal, and our now principal, and was Deputy Alan Gio, and said, I want to organise a wellbeing group that's the separate Indigenous only wellbeing group where students from kindergarten to year 12 meet and they get to know each other. And it wasn't to segregate our Indigenous students, it was actually to bring them together, because I realised that we had a school that had 63 students in it that didn't even know that there was maybe another 50 odd plus Indigenous kids in the school. So we're about 2 years into that project now, and actually we're just filling out, because our school's part of the AIS New South Wales Waratah project. I was just writing our yearly report on that, and one of the things I did was
too.
What's that?
I'm writing the Waratah report too.
And one of the things I did there was, you've got to gather some data, and I surveyed all our students and said, you know, does this make you feel culturally accepted? And, you know, what are the things you've got out of it? And it was like from kindergarten to year 12, the same thing. I feel part of a family. I feel like I belong. I now know that there's other kids just like me at the school. And the subtle things that you can't buy. So as part of that wellbeing group, I introduced a Indigenous prefect role into our school. And that student works as a leader to all of our students in that sphere, but particularly within that wellbeing group. And I was really privileged to walk through the school with Charlotte just before she sat her final HSC exams. And I witnessed something which is all I could have ever asked for, was our younger Indigenous students trying to get her eye contact. And just as we walked through the school, and she was equally looking for them. And students that might not have known her, or might not have known that she was a proud Quandamoko woman, and she's now become a real asset to our school. She's going to go on and do really remarkable things. But seeing that connection, high school students having primary school students run up to them and give them a hug, and the amount of staff who've come to that, we call it our mob, is that wellbeing group. And staff who have come and they've just said, these kids are just so tight. They're so incredibly tight. And I said, that happened within half an hour. It was a cultural tightness that you can't buy. It was just this recognition of, oh, yeah, you're a black fella. Yep, yeah, me too. Bang, they were together, and they've been like family ever since. So build trust, get your kids connected, and get them proud. But all of that has to exist in the creation of a culturally safe and environment within your school.
Yeah, that's powerful, Chris. Thank you. Phillip, I'm wondering now, with respect to Justine, if we can go back to Justine, age 19 or 20, and ask you as a school leader, perhaps, when you have teachers perhaps joining the school, or who may not have the kind of experience with local community, who have come from potentially even overseas. We have had a question about teachers who have come from overseas. How would you work with them to sort of communicate the importance of some of these approaches, these pedagogical approaches, which are so inclusive for our local First Nations communities?
Thanks, Lauren. Is that to me, that question? Oh, thanks. Gorgeous stories, Chris and Justine. Thank you. Just love them. Look, it's a twee answer is we're sort of known for doing this. So people are aware what we're on about. So we've been kind of loitering in this space for some years and making mistakes and, needing to correct them, some strong steps and missteps and reverse and sideways steps to try to figure out how to do the relationship piece well. And a number of colleagues who come want to experience that. They expressly say they want to open up their own soul to a part of Australia about which they've had no awareness and no direct contact. Justine made an excellent point. The truth of the matter is most of the kids at this school wouldn't meet Indigenous people, wouldn't meet an Aboriginal person, let alone make a friend with them. And so that was a big step. And I think that's the same for our teachers. I'm quite explicit in interviews to say this is what we're doing. You need to be aware of that. And do you feel you can make a contribution to that? And the overwhelming sense is that this is something that they value, but they come in tremblingly. A few weeks ago, I was asked if I could go up to Dupamar School in Northeast Arnhem and take Richard Flanagan, the author, because Richard has come across an incredible story. You may have seen it in the Spectator, that he wants to share this story. And if I could just be very brief about the story, Lauren, it's the story of an extraordinarily detailed painting of a white cockatoo that's been found in the Vatican Library, and it dates from about the 13th century. It shouldn't be there. And he has created a story around how it got to be there, and it's to do with a Yolngu girl and her pet white cocky, who meets the Macassan traders who take her back to Macassar and then to China and eventually to Europe. And she discovers Europe. And while she's there in Italy, somebody steals her cockatoo. And the rest of the story is her recovery of the bird, and then comes back to Northeast Arnhem and is on the beach with her family and laughingly says, "I've discovered Europe. It's not that awesome there. It's far better here." And Richard is going to turn that into a bit of a children's story and wanted to sit with the children and listen to their language and their conversation. What name should we give to the little girl? How would we call the Jamakuli? Where are they? What are they doing when they're talking to the Macassans? Where do the Macassans take? What would the name of the parrot be, of the cockatoo? How would she feel when she lost the cockatoo? How would she recover it? What does she think when she gets to Rome? What's so weird and strange about her discovery of Europe? And then why is it so awesome back on the beach in Arnhem with the Baru and the amazing experiences of the terrain there? Richard wanted to hear the kids' knowledge. Now, in Australian terms, in Australian curriculum terms, they would be on the bottom of our measurement system. But they carry a genius about which we know nothing. And their abstraction of relationships and relationship to land and country is so ingenious, so detailed and so moving. We need to open that up to be fully Australian, to really fully understand what it is to live here. And we don't need to occupy and control and command it. We need to experience it, enjoy it, and accept our responsibility. A teacher needs to understand that. It's that old picture of a goldfish trying to climb a tree and, are they successful? And, how do you assess? How do you determine what knowledge to privilege? And then how do you establish what constitutes leadership and capacity and the contribution to the world? And so a teacher coming into that environment needs to let go of a whole lot of assumptions while we walk together in two worlds.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you. Chris, could I ask you to build on that a little bit and talk about, let's say, perhaps a discipline-specific classroom, a maths teacher. How would you work with a maths teacher to suggest or support them to think about doing things in a slightly different way, to bring in some of these ways of thinking, ways of communicating that we've talked about? What would you say to that maths teacher?
Yeah, you got me on my most undesirable topic, maths.
Sorry, you can make it something else if you like.
No. I like the challenge, because it is actually one of the ones that comes up the most. Is I have maths teachers come up to me and go, "I'm really just struggling with this. Like, how do I do it?" And only a couple of weeks ago, I had a teacher speak to me about, I don't know, I went to a conference years and years ago, and they just said, I just use Australian animals and talk about that and count kangaroos. And I thought, just head went into my hands. I thought, there's so much cultural complexity that you can weave through and talk about, whether in any subject, if it's maths, you could talk about celestial navigation. You could, I've even just got, there's a bunch of things here. And one of the things I will say is right beside me, I have a teacher resource library, which I created. So rather than our staff having to go through their own faculty library or the school's library to find stuff, they just come to my office and borrow it out like they would a first aid kit. But right next to me is this wonderful game here, Footy Feud. It's a card game that's maths based, that just links in AFL. I've got a student at our school who I recently took to the Charles Sturt University Deadly Pathways Day, whose mum said to me and he said to me, he said, I don't know why I'd want to go to that. I'm not going to go to university. I'm just not academic. He went to that day. A friend of mine, Corey Tutt, who you might be familiar with, who runs Deadly Science, he spoke on the day and handed out some books to people who asked a good question. Nick asked a really great question and Corey handed him a book, which was this book. This book, Thinks You're Deadly. The very next day, I get a phone call from Nick's mum. He said, Nick hasn't read a book in I can't remember how long. I walked past his room last night. He'd found his glasses, which have been missing for 3 years, and he was sitting there reading that book. Why was he reading that book? Because he felt culturally empowered. He felt like he mattered and what he had to say mattered and what was in that book mattered to him. So it's not counting kangaroos. It's finding things that whether it be for our Indigenous students, that they can connect to and they can see their culture through. And if for our non-Indigenous students, they can do the opposite. They can connect back into culture through learning about, just as Phillip said, the unmeasurable amount of knowledge and wisdom that is within this land. Actually, kind of, when you said that, Phillip, I teared up a little bit because I know exactly what you mean there.
Yeah, that's fabulous. That's a great example, and thank you. And I put the website, the link to the 8 Ways framework into the chat as well. It's one way, it's one framework, it's one set of approaches, but it's a nice introduction, I think, if it's something that you want to explore and feel that you lack sort of confidence and agency perhaps in doing. I'm aware
8 ways you mentioned then, Lauren.
Yeah,
and look, the one thing I just would say is that we have a local 8 Ways teacher who has spent a lot of time, because it's a knowledge system that comes from Western New South Wales, and he really requested of us. He said, look, use the knowledge that's within the 8 Ways website and all the literature that you can find on it, but please be respectful of where that knowledge comes from. I think actually on their website, I had it written down here, something I really love. it says here, please observe the protocol on our homepage. If you use something from here, please put something back.
Yes.
And I love that. So I think just be mindful that it's often advised that you are trained in it as well, that you don't just go on the website and go, okay, cool, I'm now know how to teach 8 ways. Do some ringing around, talk to those guys. They're really, really wonderful. And you may well have in your local area someone who is trained in 8 ways who can help roll that out into your classroom.
And there is some fabulous professional learning in the area as well. Yeah. So
sorry to interrupt you then.
Yeah. So Deadly Science was the other organisation that you just mentioned there from Corey. Yeah. So, and just to mention as well, I mean, I'm very privileged to be working with the Centre of Excellence for Australian Biodiversity and Heritage, and that is a group of 80+ scientists who are working on country from the top of the Torres Strait right down to Gippsland, and actually into Tasmania, but they're working on country with local communities. So they're working on bringing together local knowledges and so-called Western science. And so there is a lot more work being done in this area. And we work with Corey at Deadly Science at sort of developing education resources, and he's fabulous. So Deadly Science, I haven't quite got the website at hand, but that's another organisation that's really well worth referring to. Yeah, wonderful. Now, we're just so close to the end, and it's really sad. I feel that I haven't got through a lot of what people would want to hear, but also by the same token, we've heard some incredible stories and incredible messages, which were equally valuable and very important to hear too. We have got some questions around perhaps sort of more politically sensitive areas. And these were teachers who wanted to know how to deal with, for example, the referendum. If you have students from First Nations students, or you have communities that are likely to be impacted by political changes and decisions and that could be very potentially traumatic. Is there something that you have done in that sort of context? Have you worked with your students or your teachers? Can I just ask maybe Phillip for you to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, Lauren. Thanks. For my sins, I was quoted in the Yes pamphlet. So I was sort of unmasked right at the start. And the kids were curious about that. So both sides of government have been to Arnhem Land and seen the Tupama, and so you get drawn into these things a little bit. So I was keen to get the kids to talk without politicisation, but not about whether they would vote yes or no, but actually what they understood the question to be, and then how do we illustrate respect? What's the best way to illustrate respect? Understand what it is that the First People are asking for, and how they framed their response for themselves. And, I'm very grateful to lots of senior students who got on board with that. And I was quite intentional about not putting any of our kids into the narrative, so that allow them the space. But I think that like all of these complex questions that are before the nation, and this one is right at the heart of everything. I think honesty and integrity and respect go a long way in teaching civil discourse at school level. Twee answer, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Phillip. Yeah, Justine, would you have anything to add to that?
No, very similar. I've had some notes on that and just said bring it back to education. Like someone who understands a political issue understands all the sides of it, and so and all the points of view. So don't make it about taking sides. Make it about empowering them through knowledge and like learning what is the problem here, what are people trying to do, what's everyone's point of views, and so working through it that way. So
yeah, thank you, Chris. Did you address this?
I think actually, correct me if I'm wrong, the other schools might be similar to St. Columba in that we're on the deep learning journey. And I've just sort of encouraged both our staff as well as our students to create an environment that encourages robust, inclusive, and culturally sensitive debate and discussion. Ultimately, I think that's what we should be doing, regardless of the subject matter. As a geography teacher, it's kind of comes up all the time, whether it be speaking about Indigenous content or climate change or whatever it might be. I just think it's creating an environment that encourages critical thinking, that encourages our staff and students to talk openly, and but at the same time, when it's something like this that is very, very culturally sensitive, if you are not a First Nations person, I think to be walking into that space with a listening ear, and as my grandfather would have said, with love as your first step.
Yeah, very, very good message. Thank you. And unfortunately, we have come to our end, but I would like to just ask each of you, what is the one key thing that you would like the teachers who are joining us today, what would you like them to take away from this conversation today? Phillip, I might ask you first.
Sure. That's a tough one to ask for just one, but let me give it a shot. Don't be frightened by mistakes. Mistakes will happen, and you'll learn from them, because the generosity of First Nation people surpasses their the offence that you might give by a mistake. Don't be frightened off by mistakes or the fear of the unknown. Give it a go, because it matters that much.
Absolutely, thank you. Justine.
I guess, going back on something Phillip sort of touched on earlier, just about the enormous wealth of knowledge that we have in our First Nations people here in the country, and something which one of my Year 7 boys said to me this year. He said, after dealing with some racism, his response to me was, I just want them to see how cool Aboriginal culture is. And that really hit me. And I guess particularly with young people, and I think it would have been different, there's so much amazing, cool stuff about Aboriginal culture. It's just phenomenal. And we can all be a part of sharing and learning and teaching that. And that's going to make such a difference to the next generation coming through.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Thanks, Justine. And Chris, the last word.
Yeah, look, listen. I suppose, to quote Biripi elder Uncle Wayne Anderson, he said to me, do small things and do them well, young man. He said, we're not expecting you to change your school overnight. Just do small things and do them well, and community will see that, and they'll recognize what you're doing, as opposed to trying to do 1,000 things and tripping up. But I think, as Phillip said, be brave to walk into this space, and like I said earlier, have a genuine interest and a genuine want to know this, not because you work in a school and because it's part of a syllabus, but really, really want to. I'm sure if anyone has signed up to this, they probably already are there, or at least beginning that journey. But connect to country, connect to people, and listen to what you can learn from that. And that's the place to start.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. It's been absolutely wonderful, and hopefully we can have you back again next year. That would be wonderful. Thank you so much. Over to you, Pat.
Just sadly, we've reached the end of our discussion this evening. I can just, I'm very moved by it. Yeah, if only we could talk more about it. Who knows, in the future, maybe we could come back to this topic again. But on behalf of the Teachers Guild of New South Wales Council, I would really like to extend our gratitude to all of our panellists this evening, Phillip, Justine and Chris, for their invaluable time and dedication in facilitating this informative discussion, and the relevance that it has at the moment, and also the opportunities and challenges surrounding the topic. The Teachers Guild of New South Wales acknowledges your contributions and commends your efforts in enhancing education, fostering professional development, and cultivating a vibrant professional association. So thank you. In terms of a follow-up, A recording of this event will be shared along with a certificate of attendance and a short post survey to assist us in shaping future online webinars moving forward. And this is our last one for the year. So we look forward to seeing you next year and hopefully seeing you also participate in future Guild events. Please stay safe and well, and thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Phillip. Too.
Marambul.
Thanks very much. Thank you.